Prime Minister attends World Economic Forum in Davos. Review of Vietnam's economic highlights in 2016. Hello and welcome to this edition of BizLine brought to you by VTV International. Also the last BizLine episode of the Year of the Monkey. As date of the Lunar New Year is around the corner, we wish you all a happy holiday. But first, let's just check out the top business news of the past week.
Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc arrived in Davos, Switzerland to attend the 47th World Economic Forum on Wednesday, Vietnam time. He had a meeting with the forum's chairman Klaus Schwab. The two sides signed an agreement in which the World Economic Forum will connect Vietnam with economic experts and researchers. Prime Minister Phúc also met ADB President Takehiko Nakao, World Trade Organization Director General Roberto Azevedo, and leaders of 17 international banks and ventures which are investing in Vietnam and others. Through the meetings, Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc reaffirmed Vietnam's determination to further cooperation with enterprises worldwide and actively participate in international business forums in the coming time.
Vietnam is now officially the world's second-largest footwear exporter by volume, just behind China. The Vietnam Leather Footwear and Handbag Association said, citing recent statistics from the World Footwear Association. The country supplies more than 1 billion footwear products of all kinds per year, accounting for 7.3% of the global market share. Vietnam is also the world's second-largest exporter of sports shoes and the third global exporter of leather footwear.
17 Vietnamese banks were listed among the 500 strongest banks in the Asia-Pacific region. Of the 17 Vietnamese banks, the Investment and Development Bank of Vietnam, or BIDV, Vietinbank and Vietcombank were ranked highest at 161st, 173rd and 193rd respectively. The list was based on assets of banks in the region, including countries like Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, Singapore and Vietnam.
The list of the top 500 companies in Vietnam in 2016 was announced at a ceremony in Hanoi on Thursday. Trường Hải Automobile Company took first place in the list of top Vietnamese private enterprises in 2016, followed by Vietnam Dairy Products Joint Stock Company, Vinamilk, Doji Gold and Gems Group, FPT Corporation and Vingroup. Trường Hải Automobile Company of THACO has had 3 consecutive years of leading the national automobile market. In 2016, the total automotive sales of enterprises reached nearly 113,000 automobiles, equivalent to more than 300 cars sold each day.
3 submarine cable systems that provide internet connectivity for Vietnam, AEG, APG and IA, were all malfunctioning at the same time. While slowing down connection for common users, import-export enterprises and firms working online are facing a lot of difficulties. Interaction on brand and product fan pages are dropping, leading to a decrease in sales. Internet providers have said that the internet connection will go back to normal on January the 23rd or February the 7th at the longest.
We have just reviewed the business news of the past week. Up next in our crosstalk, we will review the Vietnam's economic highlights in 2016. 2016 wrapped up with no major breakthrough for the Vietnam's economy. Last year, Vietnam suffered negative impacts from several external factors, such as extreme weather conditions, a global economic slowdown, fall in crude oil and agro-produce prices. Yet, Vietnam still managed to maintain a stable growth rate and achieve a record development in some areas. In the last edition of BizLine this lunar year, we will take a look at the highlights in Vietnam's economic picture in our crosstalk. And we have our guest today to our BizLine program, Dr. Sebastian Eckert, Chief Economist of World Bank in Vietnam, and Dr. Trần Toàn Thắng, Deputy Director of Department on Business Environment and Competitiveness of Central Institute for Economic Management. Thank you for joining our BizLine program today.
Thank you for having us.
But first, let's take a look at some record highs of Vietnam in the past year.
2016 was a difficult year for Vietnam's economy due to the impact of severe weather conditions and global economic weakening. The country posted a 6.21% GDP growth in 2016, lower than its set target of 6.7%, yet still higher than the rates recorded by many countries in the region. In addition, particular sectors experienced positive results in the past year. Specifically, for the first time, the number of newly established firms surpassed 100,000, with 111,000 enterprises. Foreign currency reserves hit a record of $41 billion. The disbursement of foreign direct investment hit a record of $15.8 billion. Export value increased 6.8%, and export surplus reached $2.68 billion.
Vietnam's economy in 2016 saw some record high, but we also haven't met some targets. So in your opinion, was it a successful year for the Vietnam's economy? We begin with Dr. Eckhart first.
Thank you, Lina. I mean, overall, if we look at the economic performance of Vietnam in 2016, I would say it was indeed a strong year. Economic growth at 6.2%, also slightly below the official target, is a very solid performance. It's driven by robust domestic consumption as well as continued strong performance of export-oriented manufacturing sector. Also, importantly, strong growth was accompanied by now the 5th consecutive year of broad macroeconomic stability, so inflation remains low, below the 5% target. All of this shows that the economy is indeed in a very good position.
The more important thing for Vietnam is in 2016 we also faced with a lot of difficulties, both in terms of external sources, risk, and also internal one. Internal one include the weather that affect severely the agriculture, make the first half of the year with the negative growth in agriculture. And until the end of the year, the agriculture is still quite low, about 1.3%, contributes quite little to GDP growth. And also we have some problem with the state budget deficits. The estimates from the Ministry of Finance, we might still get quite high budget deficits at about 5.3%, still higher the target about 4.9%, and that will be quite a big problem in the near future.
Let's talk about one significant figure in 2016, which is the number of newly established enterprises, which reached the record high of 111,000 enterprises in a year. So how does this figure translate into economic impacts?
I think it's good, of course, to have a lot of new firms coming on stream. But I think what we see is that currently in Vietnam, if you look at the domestic private sector, the vast majority of firms, 96% of firms, are small and micro enterprises. While it's a very good sort of development to see a lot of startups coming up, to also focus on creating an environment that allows then some of these firms to grow and to really reach a scale at which they can become more competitive, integrate with global value chains, and become more efficient producers of goods and services.
But we got about 12,000 firms completely closed down this year, and increases by about 30% compared with last year. So I mean the number of firms closed down also quite high. So actually, although the firms number of firms newly established increases, like you said, it might reflect the good economic environment in the next year, but firms still recently firms still face with a lot of difficulties, and that's should be considered.
What do you think about the figures that Dr. Tang has just mentioned, that the number of firms closing down is also increasing?
Yeah, I mean, one has to look at this comprehensively, right? I mean, in a way, firms exiting is also not necessarily a sign of a problem in the economy. In fact, what you see is a lot in very dynamic economies and very competitive economies. You see a lot of this churning. You have new firms coming in, you have firms that are not efficient exiting the markets. I think what is important is that those firms that have potential and that are efficient producers, that they have the access to productive resources, capital, land, labor. So I think it's important to create this environment for sort of medium-sized domestic firms to emerge, in a competitive market.
Mm-hmm.
This business imports some 1,000 different fabrics for production every month. Under previous provisions, as many as 1,000 textile samples had gone through formaldehyde tests. This used to cost the firm around $1 million per year, but this regulation was removed over a month ago.
Tôi có thể rút ngắn được cái thời gian thông quan từ 3 đến 5 ngày, bây giờ xuống còn 1 đến 3 ngày. Và mỗi một năm thì chúng tôi tiết kiệm được khoảng từ 3 đến 5 tỷ đồng cho cái việc chi phí kiểm nghiệm.
In Hưng-Yên province, Japanese firms only access a single window mechanism to get investment licenses thanks to this business support center, which has centralized all business agencies.
We scan their profiles, consult and guide them with how to complete all necessary procedures.
Mục tiêu là phục vụ doanh nghiệp để tiếp cận hiểu cái môi trường đầu tư ở tỉnh Hưng Yên một cách nhanh nhất và rõ nhất.
In 2016, Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc affirmed to building a tectonic government, contributing to improving the business environment.
Trước tiên là về mặt thủ tục hành chính. Thủ tục hành chính thì có thể nói rằng đã là một bước tiến rất là xa. Và so với những giai đoạn trước đây thì phải thực sự là thấy có cái sự thay đổi.
Recent surveys by the Vietnam Small and Medium-Sized Enterprises Association have indicated that unofficial costs related to tax and customs have reduced by 28%. This is one of the contributors to business development in Vietnam recently, underlining the government's determination to dramatically improve the business environment.
Do you think the number of newly established firms reflect optimism in the government's vow to create a tectonic government in Vietnam?
A tectonic word is a bit difficult to understand for people. But if we use of the facilitating government or the developmental government or creative government, that's easier to understand. Yes, the number of newly established firms reflect what the government reformed so far. It's quite good. At least it generates the long-term view for enterprise. They can think that yes, this year, there reform, and next year maybe more reform, and that's make things become better.
Well, I think I agree with Mr. Tang. I think this idea of having an enabling or facilitating government creates an environment for private sector enterprises to flourish. I think it's also important to then translate that principle, that very broad principle, into concrete actions. And I think what we see is that if we look back, Vietnam has indeed very much, as Mr. Tang has said, made progress, for example, with regard to improving the business climate. If we look, for example, at the doing business indicators, Vietnam jumped 9 ranks this in the last assessment, which is a good outcome, and it's showing that the business climate is improving. And I think it in turn facilitates then the creation of firms and also the growth, hopefully, of existing firms. Now, I also want to say that the business climate is only one aspect. I think it's also important to look at some of the structural reforms, for example, the continued reforms of the state-owned sector are a very important part of this idea of moving towards a facilitating or enabling government. And then finally, I think what is also important is to continue the reforms in the banking sector. And I think all of that shows that the government is determined, that there's a clear principle guiding the reform plans, but now the challenge is to continue moving forward with concrete implementation across these various areas.
What's your prediction of the business environment in Vietnam in 2017?
Well, I think that you will see continued improvements. All the plans show, you look at the Resolution 19, you look at the economic restructuring plan that was adopted, you look at the SEDP, the Socio-Economic Development Plan for the next 5 years. All of these plans indicate that the government is committed to move forward with reforms, and I think, it will be gradual reform progress because all of these different areas, it's difficult reforms, they are complex. So it takes time to implement them, but I think we will see steady progress over the coming year and then also looking over the medium term.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. The year 2017 that's a very important year for the government to start to do their job, and I think they will do quite a good job. We also should look at the international perspectives because of the TPP or some unstable geopolitical issues. It might be affect the business environment in Vietnam. However, I agree that in 2017 we will look forward for a quite a good business environment.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks to the improvement in business and investment environment, Vietnam also saw a record high in FDI disbursement in 2016. FDI disbursement in 2015 reached a record high of $14.5 billion. However, it took the first 11 months in 2016 to reach the same figure. By year-end, the disbursement stood at a record number of some $16 billion.
Khi vốn thực hiện mà mở rộng, điều này cho thấy rằng là các cơ hội đầu tư cũng như các điều kiện đầu tư ở trong nước làm tốt. Thứ hai là các cái chủ dự án là tin tưởng cũng như là có kế hoạch làm ăn lâu dài, và đặc biệt là có cái triển vọng thu lợi nhuận và phát triển tốt.
Priority projects are high-tech ones, but don't threaten the environment.
Nâng cao năng lực lựa chọn dự án và nhà đầu tư của các ủy ban nhân dân tỉnh, thành phố, các ban quản lý các khu công nghiệp, khu chế xuất, khu kinh tế là quan trọng để chúng ta không phải trả giá cho cái việc thu hút tiếp đầu tư nước ngoài vào những lĩnh vực mà gây ra ô nhiễm môi trường, phát thải khí nhà kính, mà chúng ta thu hút đúng định hướng của Đảng và Chính phủ đã đề ra, chất lượng cao hơn, hiệu quả kinh tế lớn hơn.
So this year, FDI disbursement also set a new record 2 years in a row. So what are the reasons for behind that growth?
If we look at the last year, indeed, we see about 16 billion FDI inflow into Vietnam, and it's the second year of a record high. This is a reflection of a stable macroeconomic environment, but also a reflection of some fundamental strengths of Vietnam's economy. For example, the geographical location, very close, to global supply chains. You have a very well-skilled population, and that, of course, makes for a very attractive destination for FDI, given that Vietnam's wages are still very competitive. So I think that's why you see a lot of inflow. Of course, Dr. Thang mentioned the uncertain prospects of TPP, but Vietnam nevertheless has signed more free trade agreements than any other country in the region. There are about 15 FTAs. Very much part of the government strategy to use openness to facilitate economic development here in Vietnam. And I think that's why you see this inflow of foreign direct investment into the economy.
What sectors do you think contributed the most to that $16 billion disbursement of FDI?
Now they're quite good positive that the manufacturing now contribute higher than some other sectors. Some years before, real estate is really the huge sector, but now manufacturing share about more than 66% of the total implemented capital. This year and last year, we have a quite good project in terms of electricity, electronics, or some like Samsung or some other big companies. But that's good evidence that there's a change in the structure of FDI in Vietnam.
We have the latest number that the number of registered FDI projects in Vietnam in 2016 increases compared to 2015. However, the total capital fell compared to 2015. So does that mean that foreign investors invest in smaller scaled projects?
Yeah, I think part of that is also because you had very big, chunky investment like Samsung is of course the famous one coming in the past. So it's also basically the effect of that now you're probably moving towards more regular, sized and scale of investment. So I wouldn't read too much into that. In fact, I would say diversification is generally a good thing. If you have more investors, different firms, different sectors, I think that strengthens the economy. Now, I do want to pick up on this point about the contribution of the FDIs to the economy. If we look at it, 70% of the exports are coming from FDI enterprises. So I would say that there's definitely a positive contribution, but I think in order to maximize the potential benefits to the economy, it's important now to also bring in the domestic private sector, which comes back to what we discussed earlier, how you create an environment where you can have domestic firms that have the capacity and are competitive enough to link into these global supply chains.
One of the headlines in the picture of Vietnam's economy in 2016 was the switch in trade balance. According to statistics from the General Department of Customs, in 2015, the country saw a trade deficit of $3.55 billion and then reversed it to achieve a trade surplus of $2.68 billion last year. The FDI sector accounted for over 71% of Vietnam's export revenue, standing at nearly $126 billion, and recorded a trade surplus of $23 billion in 2016, helping Vietnam rack up a trade surplus of nearly $3 billion.
What are the factors behind Vietnam's switch in trade balance in 2016? Because we moved from a trade deficit in 2015 to a trade surplus in 2016. And which sectors contributed to this surplus?
So if we look at what happened in the trade balance, one factor is that Vietnam's exports continue to perform quite strongly, as I mentioned, around 9% export growth in the last year. At the same time, import growth slowed down markedly compared to 2015. So you have now import growth at around 5.5%, and that really made the big difference. That trend will likely reverse if, in this year and then the medium term, because, as you have a record FDI coming in, what these firms will do is they will import machinery, equipment to, build their factories, and that usually increases the import bill. So I would not be surprised if we see a reversal in the trade balance this year, or at least over the medium term. Now, that's not a bad thing. Vietnam's imports of capital goods is good because it contributes to the expansion of the productive capacity. In that sense, it's actually something that is very positive in the sense that it really is part of the overall FDI and investment stock.
I think trade surplus this year is a bit surprising to me, actually, because of the slowdown in the international market, and also in terms of the price factor, because a lot of the commodity the price reduce very significantly. So the real amount is still increase, but the value is slow down.
Some people think that this trade surplus is mostly driven by the FDI companies sector, while the domestic enterprises still face a trade deficit. Some say that Vietnam's export sector is now too dependent on FDI sector. So what's your opinion about this?
I do think that this over-reliance on the FDI sector for export performance is something that in the longer run needs to be addressed in a way. And in order to avoid that, I think it's important to create an environment where the domestic sector can become direct exporters. So I think there is a challenge there, but there's also an opportunity, because if Vietnam succeeds and it expands its contribution and participation in these global value chains, and I think it has every potential to do so, it can actually fuel growth not only in 2017, but for a much longer time.
Vietnam also need to think about the crowding out or crowding in effect of FDI. That's in one of my research. 1% increase in the FDI for given sectors, it will make the probability of survival of domestic firm reduced by 12%. That's quite a significant figure. If Vietnam want to improve their domestic enterprise growth, they need to do both hands. One is the FDI firm to create this more link with the domestic firm, but the second hand is the SOE reform, so that it make the crowding out effect is less than right now.
So to summarize our program, in your opinion, what do you think is the most impressive progress Vietnam has made in 2016 in terms of economic development?
Well, I wouldn't single out any single trend. I would say that Vietnam's overall economic performance, so solid growth accompanied by broad macroeconomic stability, inflation under control, stable exchange rate, strong external position, are really remarkable, especially against the backdrop of the drought that affected the agricultural production in the first half of the year, against the backdrop of a continued weakness in the global economy. So I wouldn't single out any particular number, but I think overall the performance of the economy in 2016 is quite strong.
Yes, Vietnam got a good growth, got a good number of firm established, get a good export performance, and also get good inflation stability. I just would like to add that one point is that there are a lot of things remain and need to do more with that in next year.
Once again, thank you very much, Dr. Sebastian Eckhart and Dr. Trần Toàn Thắng for joining our BizLine program.
Pleasure.
In 2016, Vietnam signed a number of milestone free trade agreements. Last year saw a boom in the amount of registered firms and expansion capital disbursement for FDI companies, who contributed 70% of Vietnam's export growth. Vegetable and fruit processing also saw significant growth last year, thanks to the application of advanced preservation techniques and safe production standards. But these achievements are still modest compared to Vietnam's targets in terms of economic development. So what prospects lies ahead for Vietnam in 2017, and what investment trends should we pay attention to? Our BizLine next week will give you the answer. For now, we would like to thank you for joining us through our over 50 editions of BizLine over the past year. Our program has closely followed the major trends of national economy in 2016, such as the integration process, improved business environment, or stories of startups. And for the year of the rooster, BizLine will continue to deliver latest business news and accompany the development of Vietnam's economy. Again, we wish you a merry time with family during the Tết holidays and Happy New Year. And that also wraps up this edition of BizLine. Thank you very much for watching. You can always rewatch our program at vtv4.vn or youtube.com/vtv4go. From our team here in Hanoi, until next time.